Hi, my name is Ken Davidian, and welcome to Season 2 of Organization Theory in Space. During this season, I'm covering one chapter in every video of the Oxford Handbook of Organizational Change and Innovation, second edition, edited by Marshall Scott Poole and Andy Van de Ven. This video covers Chapter 17 of the handbook, entitled Institutional Change. In this video, we'll look at current research of institutional change, including the generative processes driving change and the patterns of change over time. We'll then discuss 4 types of institutional change processes, including 2 well-studied topics, institutional displacement and institutional alignment, and 2 understudied lines of research, institutional accretion and institutional accommodation. Traditionally, research on institutional change focused on exogenous, top-down shocks that triggered organizations to respond. These shocks came from the environment, such as shifts in political regimes or socio-political upheavals like wars. Initially, this research focused on how these jolts changed the institutions themselves, but later research assessed the impact of these shocks on individual organizations that also adapted in response. Finally, in this vein, the concept of institutional logics emerged. Institutional logics are defined as the socially constructed historical patterns of cultural symbols and material practices, assumptions, values, and beliefs by which individuals produce and reproduce their material subsistence, organize time and space, and provide meaning to their daily activity. Institutional change occurs when there are shifts from one logic to another. For example, the academic publishing ecosystem underwent a shift from an institutional logic to a market logic with the advent of the open access movement. Institutional entrepreneurship next emerged as an endogenous source of change, describing how individual actors work to alter their surroundings. This line of research highlighted the concept that institutions were more complex than previously assumed, encompassing multiple logics instead of only one. The concept of institutional voids emerged, as did the intersection of social movement and institutional change research. Finally, a line of research emerged focusing on how individual actors and practice-driven change resulted in institutional change. 2 trends resulted from this research, including an interest in integrating institutional analysis and micro-level organizational processes, and a more sophisticated, broader, and meaningful institutional logics perspective. To integrate the various change models, the authors constructed a 2x2 matrix based on the scope of change and the pace of change. The scope of change is described as developmental if the institution is growing or slowly changing, or transformation if the change is more extreme. The pace of change is characterized as evolutionary, more mild, or revolutionary, more extreme. This typology updates previous work that focused only on the field level of analysis and considered institutions as rule systems. These systems primarily considered organizational change based on the drivers of individual interests in politics. The current typology updates the previous work by highlighting the roles of culture, cognition, practice, and agency. Traditional research perceived institutions as rule systems that constrain actors, whereas newer research perceives institutions as cultural systems that enable actors and their interests. These are 2 very different ontological starting points. The next couple of slides will discuss each of the 4 modes of institutional change, including institutional displacement, alignment, accretion, and accommodation. Institutional displacement occurs at a revolutionary pace and results in transformational change. This occurs through 3 classes of mechanisms, including selection, conversion, and sociocultural reconfiguration. The selection mechanism assumes institutions try to change to fit their environment conditions, and if the attempted change is unsuccessful, then the institution is displaced. Resource scarcity may also be the cause of displacement due to a loss of legitimacy. Conversion is an adaptive mechanism that assumes institutions substantially change to maximize environmental fitness instead of being displaced. This change may require strong leadership if the change is urgent and inevitable. Finally, sociocultural reconfiguration is driven by a change in the underlying culture or identity instead of an attempt toward environmental fitness. Institutional alignment is the second of the 4 change pathways and results from an evolutionary pace of change and a developmental change in the institutions. In this situation, institutions are adaptable and may co-evolve through three endogenous mechanisms: propelling, internalizing, and institutionalization. Institutional change via propelling is a result of endogenous triggers and institutional entrepreneurs. Internalizing mechanisms follow the propelling mechanisms, realigning the new institutional arrangements through effective or ceremonial activities that internalize the necessary changes to ensure environmental fitness. Institutionalization is a restabilization of the institutional form that ensures the cognitive legitimacy required for future operations. Institutional accretion is the third pathway that describes the evolutionary pace of change that results in a transformational change of the institution. This is an understudied line of research and can benefit from further theorizing. This pathway of change originates from events that are relatively non-disruptive, but results from a major institutional change based on the accumulation of many small adjustments. Accretion differs from alignment in that the taken for granted legitimacy of the institution is never lost, but it slowly adjusts over time. There are two mechanisms suggested by the research that can escalate the small changes as they occur, and these are technology-driven mechanisms and practice-driven mechanisms. Technology-driven mechanisms unfold incrementally as innovations are introduced and accepted in a cyclic pattern. Innovations that are sticky, meaning they're easy to adopt but hard to give up, are thought to be more effective at catalyzing institutional change. Practice-driven mechanisms result in institutional changes when they are performed repeatedly, and every time they're performed, they become increasingly accepted as part of the symbolic repertoire of the institution. The final pathway is institutional accommodation, representing revolutionary pace of change and a developmental change in the institution. This is another understudied line of research, partly because it's hard to capture empirically. The change is so quick and dramatic, and yet the change is only developmental. Not much is known about the circumstances that prevent the change from going all the way to being entirely transformational. And understanding those de-escalating mechanisms may be the key to understanding this change pathway. 4 mechanisms have been identified, but few studies have been done in this area as of the writing of this handbook. The first study identified boundary work and practice work as accommodation passed through the institutional life cycle of stability, conflict, innovation, and restabilization. Outside actors initially destabilize the institution through conflict. Innovation is employed to identify new institutional arrangements, and then practice pushes out these innovations through until restabilization is achieved. The second mechanism is mutual co-optation as the primary de-escalating mechanism. The more that institutional boundaries are permeable, the more that external actors can collaborate and then co-opt the institution to generate change. The third de-escalating mechanism is called translation of problematization, where the problem is translated over time to something that allows institutional accommodation. Finally, a mechanism called decoupling is identified, where threatening practices were broken apart, and then infused with new meanings to gain legitimacy and acceptance. Well, that's it for chapter 17. There's a lot here, but it's super, super interesting. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope that you consider hitting the subscribe button and notification bell so that you'll be notified whenever new videos are released. OT in Space was produced by IRL, which stands for Impossible Research LLC. IRL conducts process research on the topics of innovation and industry emergence within the space sector context. IRL also offers services of organization theory consulting, research consulting, and STEAM outreach. This video is intended for educational purposes only.